Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me and coming back for another round. And this is another round of discussion with my great friend, Jon Atack, my brother from another mother, friend from across the pond. Hey, Jon, welcome back to my show.
Yeah, great to see you, Chris. As ever.
Thank you. Yeah.
It goes back, it's 10 years now. It goes back 10 years since we started doing this.
So much. It's weird because the time passes and you don't think about it at all, or you think about it every now and again, but then something like 10 years happens, or I don't know, somehow these 10-year marks seem to sneak up on you, and then when they hit you, it's sort of like, oh my God, it has been that long, hasn't it? And you can sort of see this whole mosaic or blanket of experiences that have happened to you, but at the same time, it just feels like yesterday that we were meeting in Canada for the first time. I mean, it's just weird, the feelings of that.
Yeah, I mean, 2 points there. Roger Waters, and then one day you find 10 years have got behind you. No one told you where to run. You missed the starting gun. And that's one way of looking at it. The other thing is something that I realized about memory a while ago is that memory is always exactly the same distance from you, no matter when the event happened.
That's a great point. That's a great point. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And it was great. Toronto was that was an incredible experience for most of the people concerned. We got high together without the use of substances, though I think there was one or two people who we won't name, and just reveling in this bizarre material. I mean, one of the things that it's so hard, we're still doing this after it's 42 years for me. In fact, it's more than 50 years since I first met these ideas, and they're still fascinating. But I'm sure that if I'd been a Rajneeshi, I'd have got bored a long time ago. It's like, oh yeah, this bloke who was prematurely seriously aged. He was only 58 when he died, and you can't believe that looking at pictures of Rajneesh, who called himself the Supreme Lord, Bhagwan. I said that to a Hindu one day, and they went, he calls himself what? But it's boring, and some young man boring. Hubbard is just endlessly fascinating and endlessly bizarre and endlessly weird. It's got everything.
It really does. There are and the deeper you go, the weirder and weirder it gets.
Yeah.
I mean, I would never have been able to handle. Not really. I mean, I was seeing the occult stuff right from the get-go when I got right away. But it was bouncing off. It just wasn't making it. I couldn't process it. It was too weird, and it was too outlandish and distant from my experience of Scientology as a Sea Org member, staff member, right? I couldn't conceive of this underlying layer to this. It just wasn't computing at all. And so I would just sort of reject it, not emotionally, but just logically. I just couldn't even really process it. And it took a number of years before it finally started sinking in that there was kind of something else going on here. And because it took so long to deconstruct all the onion layers, as we say, of just the superficial stuff, just the stuff that the stuff that gets repeated so often that you think those are the fundamentals, TRs or the ARC triangle or the tone scale, and you think about these. Oh my God, the dynamics, exactly, these basics. And you think, because they call them that, oh, those must be the basics. And that's as basic or fundamental as it gets in Scientology. And then you think you're doing post-grad work when you start taking apart the axioms. And And then you come to realize, oh, that was such a cute little idea. No, the axioms are just more of the window dressing, and there is actually layers underneath this. And that's where you have to end up going into Hubbard's mind and history to really get what he was trying to do with Scientology. But it just, getting your head around that is just, and then of course you eventually end up with, in your book about the Nazis, and you're just like, holy cow, what did I get involved in here? Because once you start seeing the symbolism, as you point out, with the lightning bolts and RTC and Scientology and then the symbols of Scientology, once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it, and you realize that Hubbard was, as you have pointed out right from the get-go, but I just didn't get, was that Hubbard was laughing at us the whole time, right? With these, just hiding all the magic in plain sight, right?
All of you are arse lickers.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Exactly.
Thank you, Ron.
Exactly. Which leads me. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Cut you off.
Well, I was going to say that Hubbard got to this before us. So if you become too incredible, you become invisible. L. Ron Hubbard.
That's right. That's right.
And
that's
that statement fascinated me. It's somewhere in the data. I can't remember. It's a data series or somewhere. And I remember, sitting with that. And after I left, kind of going, oh, yeah. It's like, absolute favorite story is in Scientology. There was an advanced magazine where a lecture he'd given was reprinted, and I'm sure you know the story. And it's a Lord Dunsany story, a 19th century story, which he tells in a rather clumsy fashion, and I'm going to do a worse job of it than he did, which is basically there's a monastery that will live for 1,000 years, and it's predicted that there'll be a day, prophesied when there'll be a day that the monastery will collapse. And it has a secret that generates all of its power. And so this guy goes up from the village, and normally there'd be guards on the gate, but they know the monastery is going to fall, so they've just fallen asleep. So he walks through the guarded gate, and you get the shaggy dog story about how many doors he has to go through. And eventually he gets to the Holy of Holies. And when he gets to the Holy of Holies, he pulls aside the veil, and there's nothing there. And I can remember reading that in advance as a Scientologist and saying, what are you trying to tell me? When you pull away the veil on OT8, you'll find out that the purpose of Scientology is to stop the second coming of Christ. That's its only purpose. That's all it was for, according to Ron Hubbard on the student briefing for OT8. So what an incredible story. And as you say, for me, it was getting that he's just rebranded magic. He's just enchantment, being spellbound and all of this stuff. And what were called elementals by Aleister Crowley and others are called body thetans in Scientology. And the idea of using your intention to make things happen is thelema, or will, the founding principle. And what you are going to become is, will, a magician, a god, what have you. So yeah, a lot of blue sky has been sold. And you have, I think, getting the perspective to look at things from different places. So when you leave Scientology or any other group, you kind of go, well, those other groups are cults. The Moonies, they're a cult. We knew that when we were Scientologists. And getting people to move into that place where they say, it's all the same thing. The same mechanisms are being used, the same dynamics, which again, my book Opening Our Minds that's what it's about. And I'm very happy to say that Christian Shurko and Pascal Zevi are two of the most experienced recovery counselors in the world. Both use this book as the first thing they give to people to read, because they say, there's bound to be stuff in your group that's described in here.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's the magic part that kind of finally threw the switch for me of understanding and acceptance of what Hubbard was about. Once I got my wits around the idea of accepting the language or the wording that auditing is a ritualistic process, and getting my wits around that word ritual, because I had it so closely associated with religion and things like mass, the Catholic mass and stuff like that, that I had never, ever in my life, as a Scientologist, contemplated or used that idea for what we were doing in Scientology. Rituals, what are you talking about? But you broaden your horizons of that word and you realize, for example, that voting is an ideological ritual. It's a social ritual we engage in for our systems, things like that. Like you can expand that word a bit more beyond Catholic Mass. And once you do, you start realizing that Hubbard's rituals were coming from another practice. And that Scientology was the thing he was laying over the top of that. And once that kind of clicked, I went, oh, and then the ritual under the ritual sort of made itself clear, right? The incantations and the as they say in the OTO, from the very get-go, the manifestation of your will, your intention, what you want. I want it, there it should be, right? This was what Hubbard's thing was, and he passes this on to us. Yet at the same time, us believing in him is what's giving him the idea that he's going to be immortal. And wow, like what a circular, bunch of nonsense that has nothing to do with TRs or the ARC triangle or the tone scale. So you come to find at the end of all of this that those so-called basics were just window dressing for what was really going on, according to L. Ron Hubbard's point of view. And I think that's kind of important to understand what we were all wrapped up in, since we thought we were doing something drastically different than that, And I think at the end of the day, that's the value that I take away from diving that deep down those rabbit holes. Is it's certainly interesting to learn about Blavatsky and Templar Knights and the OTO and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I don't really have a lot of use for that. But I sure do have a lot of use for understanding that there are systems below systems, and I need to be a little bit less naive about what I'm looking at in the world when people are presenting me with stuff. That's my takeaway from knowing that stuff. It's not all just esoteric to me.
And we see things from different perspectives. Steve Kent has kindly, in 1991, he wrote a thing saying that my work would be the basis of all future study, Scientology, all scholarly study, which was nice. It was a time when I was offered a PhD, which got a bit confusing, and I didn't get it in the end because they decided I've got to do my Viva in Danish or German. But so a piece of blue sky was approved as a PhD. And then a few years ago, when I last saw him, he very graciously gave me a copy of one of his books about Scientology. Anybody who doesn't know, he's a professor at the University of Alberta and the leading academic writing about cults, I would say, certainly writing about Scientology. And in this preface to this book, he said that my work had been the basis of all scholarship in Scientology. Since then, he did a little video on my birthday this year and said he'd added Roy Wallace, because whenever he says it, I'm going, actually, the first scholar to study Scientology was Roy Wallace. Sure. Roy Wallace was a sociologist. I had the privilege of his conversation briefly when I first left Scientology, and it wrote The Road to Total Freedom, which is a very interesting book. And that was the first attempt to say something from a sociologist's point of view. There was one idea that came from sociology that stopped me in my tracks, and that was the description of Scientology as a neo-Gnostic sect.
Mm-hmm.
It was to say that you go through a series of initiations to achieve wisdom. And that whole thing, now, as you know, spent far too much time tracing that all the way back to the original mystery cults. It's where the word mystery comes from, the mysties, these people who would go through these rituals that would promise at the end liberation from death. That was all it would be. So the last ritual is generally, and I'm sorry to give this all away if anybody was spent a lot of money on being a Freemason or anything, but the last ritual is the grave of fire, where you will escape from death. And it's done differently. There are lots of groups that do it all around the world, in the East and the West, and they put you in a coffin and put the lid on. And you rise. In Korea, they've got it, because Korea is one of those places where you can do things quickly. You can do it in your lunch break at work. They bring a coffin in, you climb in, and when
Wow.
people talk about these incredible realizations they have about doing this, then you get, it used to be cave systems and taking you underground and into the darkness, and you have bull roarers in the Aborigine groups where they'll frighten the living daylights out of you, and you're meant to have crossed the barrier of death. You're meant to have achieved this state, and that's where the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, some of the Sufi sects, some of the Indian fakirs, all sorts of groups have got this idea that by putting you through a pretend death, you will then be, well, exterior from the body, to use Scientology's idea. And
Yeah.
this has been sold since, I think it dates back to about 1300 BC.
Wow.
And
Wow.
group after group after group says
That's
it.
right.
And of course, Christianity gets onto the edge of it because their rivals are Mithraists, who nobody's heard of anymore. But
Right.
Mithraism was the biggest cult of the Roman Empire. And it was exactly this thing about, he's half god, half human. Check. Just like Hercules. And by going through these rituals, and of course, in early Christianity, you had Valentinus and so many others, Basilides, who were Gnostics, who were people who are saying, you go, you learn the passwords so that you can pass through the planets to heaven. Because, of course, the universe consists of 7 planets and the sun. And that's all you've got. And I've been reading Robert Graves and Raphael Patai's commentaries on Genesis, and they've got these great things from old midrashes about when Jehovah's created the earth, he pins down the corners of the celestial heavens to the edge of the earth, but he left the northern bit loose, apparently, as a
Oh,
temptation to see if there's anybody as mighty as him. And you kind of going, when the Hubble telescope reported, it had recognized 10,000 galaxies. A couple of months ago, the James Webb came back with 780,000 galaxies.
oh my
So
God. Galaxies. Galaxies.
galaxies, each of
Not
which will
planets, not stars. Galaxies.
each of which will contain on average 100,000 million stars. And our sun is one of the little ones.
Oh
So
my God. I mean, the
we have made
scope is
such
just,
importance out of ourselves.
yeah, it's so beyond. It's so beyond. And it's so humbling. And I think that's also part of the process of this is plumbing the depths to kind of get clear on just how delusionally high and exaggerated the cult leader gets and brings us along, this euphoric awe thing, that this height of emotional peak experience that we all love so much. They brings us to, and unfortunately, this is the part that working with people that kind of sucks a little bit because it feels like you're just running around with a needle popping people's balloons at a birthday party. It kind of sucks a little bit to come down from that high, and yet reality is reality, and I get high on reality. So I'm okay with giving up the exaggerated nonsense if I can touch the grass and touch reality and have a real experience, which is, for me, what the reward is after all of this. Pie in the sky doesn't taste very good. You can't eat it. So it's kind of funny we have that high, and then we are humbled to these, more realistic lows, and having to come down from that after a cult can be difficult. It can be hard for people. I know that's one emotional reason why people don't want to leave, want to give it up.
Yeah, and better a lifetime completely deluded than a
Some
or a
people,
day completely deluded than a lifetime. But it is very much as Carl Sagan said, that the closer you get to reality, the better it is.
I agree. Yeah.
I came, Anglican Christian, moderate Christian childhood, walked away from God at the age of 13 because they were selling me this God who was really keen on us all getting very rich. And I'd seen that in the gospel that Jesus said, it's very plain. It says you can worship God or money. The
Yeah.
word mammon is used so that we won't get confused, but it means money. You can worship God or money.
Yeah.
And as Bernie Sanders said last week, they worship at the altar of money.
That's right.
Um,
They do.
and
They
that
do.
confused me. So I said, "Your God is weird, and he's about revenge and all of this stuff." I'm
Yeah.
so I just stopped believing in a big being, and he must be huge. 780,000 galaxies. That is one big. So how is a little thing like me ever going to be able to comprehend that? So I come to Meister Eckhart, a great Christian mystic, who said anything that can be said about God will not be true. And that's the end of
Ha.
the argument about God for me.
Oh, I love it. I love that statement because that, in a way, I mean, to be witty, of course, it's a wittyism, but it nails how I think about it because that's where my agnosticism lives. Is who do you think you are that you as a human being can even begin to think that you could comprehend the mind or intentions or activities of something that could create 680 billion, 100,000 million galaxies, you know, and that's just part of the universe. Like, how do you even imagine to have the arrogance or conceit to be able to think that your mind could possibly go to where that mind is? And have any idea when I know, and I think you do too, how even on a socioeconomic ladder, we can't understand each other. And there isn't anything higher on the socioeconomic ladder than God, right? So like I can't even understand rich people, much less, God, right? So this again, this is sort of the basis for my, where my agnostic base lives in my mind in terms of belief of a God figure. And it's funny, I didn't particularly intend for us to go here today, but this is really where, this recovery work and all of this work in overcoming cult stuff forces you to go if you're an inquisitive person like we are, because we end up challenging again the very fundamentals of what we were being told to believe, and you start challenging that after the fact and you start really examining the nuts and bolts of this universe and you're like, damn, this is complicated and big, a lot bigger and a lot more complicated than these simpleton answers that people cling to. And I get why they do, but I'm not going to. And I am going to say it's a simple answer to what is, at the end of the day, an incredibly complicated situation, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, religious belief and belief in general demonstrates the reality of evolution. We now know a great deal about what people believed in Sumeria, Babylon. We have Ugaritic and Hittite and Akkadian texts. I can spout these words. I don't know what I'm talking about. But it
All these ancient civilizations.
And what we see if we go before them and into what are primitive or original religious beliefs, the general belief seems to have been for a very long time that we come out of the earth. It is a matrix, which is to say, matrice, woman, matrice, matriarch. It is a womb, a matrix, and we come out of it and then we return to it. And that was believed, that's the fundamental of religion, probably for tens of thousands of years. And then you start getting perturbations in the force. And people start to get this. So we get the idea of the abyss among the Sumerians. And we have this idea of the place of shades. It's one of the terms used for it. We, when we die, are shadows of ourselves, shades. And in the original Jewish religion, out of which the Levantine Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and many and splendid forms come, the original Jewish religion, this is the life. What happens afterwards is not heaven. What happens afterwards is not the great stuff. And that's believed for a very long time. And then certain Greek ideas start to get in. And here's this idea, the mysties, this idea that there is life after death, and that you can achieve this. And the idea of resurrection comes in. So we're seeing an evolution of ideas, these ideas again. And then eventually we get to Scientology, which tops it all off by saying, you are a god, you are a super being, you can be as narcissistic as you like, And we have some special drills and exercises that will make you ever more selfish. And that, the purpose of your existence will go forward. Now, I came from Buddhism, and in Buddhism, reincarnation is called the fear of the eternal return. You are getting off the wheel of suffering. You're not going, oh, I'll do that in my next lifetime. You don't want to be living, and you're going, this is a bit nihilistic, isn't it? I'm quite happy to be living. And we come to the point where I couldn't, big follower of Chuang Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, who said, I don't know where I was before I was born. I don't know where I go after I die. Let's get on with it. And I find that I have a relatively joyous life since I put aside any idea of, you know, becoming enlightened or becoming a super being or any of this stuff. I'm relatively contented with the thought that of all of the life forms on this planet, and there may be as many as 20 million if we include all the bacteria, and the archaea and stuff like that. There may be 20 million forms of life. As far as we know, we're the only ones that have a great time. We're the only ones that have imagination, that have culture, that have art, that can make Gothic cathedrals or ballrooms. Indeed, we are, and that might not be a good idea now. Come to think about it, and dolphins look happy, but that's just because they have a fixed grin. But so much of religion is narcissistic. It's about me living forever and lighting up the sky with my name. And it's like, oh, come on, there are 8 billion of us. If there are 780,000 galaxies, there are probably quite a few more people. And God is sitting there going, oh, just leave me alone and work it out. I can't deal with so many quadrillion requests per second.
Could believe that. I mean, and that's what it would be. I mean, the Google would be a tiny figure compared to what God's dealing with on a daily, right? I mean, and the idea he cares about my masturbation. I mean, it's just, you're just.
Oh, well, no, he did tell me he was a bit worried about you doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there is that. There is that. So, yeah, it's just, I mean, well, actually, I'm really glad that we went there because it is
my good
segue here over to our code of honor discussion, which is kind of what we got together for today. So I'm gonna push us back onto that path
for a few minutes.
What I thought we would do is basically just give a little preamble here on this thing in Scientology, which John's just sitting there talking about religion and narcissism, and I'm going to point out right from the get-go here with this code of honor, it is one of the most wonderful tools Hubbard came up with to push a narcissistic attitude in certain very specific ways we'll talk about today with this code. Because for one, he pretends it's voluntary, which I love in Scientology. It's one of the few places where there's this fake facade that you really have a choice whether you're going to do this or not. Right till you have your first conversation with an ethics officer who's enraptured by it and decides to make you go do an OW write-up against the code of honor, right? Then suddenly it's not so voluntary anymore.
Write down all your sins, so we'll use them against you later, and we will.
Exactly. So just as a little intro here, so that's why we thought, I thought I'd invite Jon to break this down with me this week. Because the code of honor is a tricky thing. It really is. There's a lot of codes in Scientology. Hubbard wrote a code of an auditor, code of a Scientologist, a supervisor's code. I mean, there's a code of a Sea Org member. So there's a few of these lists of rules and guidelines for Scientologists, depending on where you're at, in the caste or hierarchy, or what job you have. Auditors supposedly, and we could do a whole thing on the auditor's code too. I mean, there's a whole thing about how you're not supposed to invalidate or evaluate for the PC, and yet it's literally baked into the auditing process that you're doing nothing but evaluating for the pre-clear.
Yeah, you've read all of these books, but never evaluate for the pre-clear. Oh, come on.
Oh, come on.
That says you must only deal with people who haven't read these books and had it evaluated to them. They've got engrams and secondaries and lots.
The worst. And that e-meter, I mean, how is that e-meter not just nothing but, right? I'm telling you, I really have this problem with my mom. Yeah, okay, I got it. But the meter, we're going to go with your dad because that's what the meter says, and then boom, there goes mom. So just as one silly example. So the code of honor is another one of these codes that Hubbard introduces. And in fact, it's one of the earliest ones. There was the auditor's code. And then there's this code of honor comes in 1954.
Yeah.
And there was a lecture Hubbard gave, and I remember it well. It was in the I think it was reprinted in the R&D Vols or something is where I first saw it. But it was a whole rundown on these points that Hubbard offers and says, look, I've got this voluntary moral code. You can't enforce a moral code. Of course, Hubbard then proceeds to do nothing but enforce moral codes for the next 3 decades. But he says you can't enforce a moral code. And so here's this list of rules that, if you volunteer to follow these, well, then you're an honorable person with integrity. And if you don't, well, then you're not, but nobody's going to judge you badly anyway. Ha ha ha. And here we go. And that's kind of my understanding of how this thing was kind of introduced. And it certainly introduces the idea into the minds of Scientologists. And I'm wondering what your experience was on your side of the pond with this in the 80s. And my experience in the 80s and 90s with this here was that this gave me an excuse to already feel better than other people. Right. This was already a right from the very early times of being a Scientologist. This is introduced to me, and this is what makes me part of the most ethical group on the planet. If I try and strive to follow this from time to time, I'll be one of those most ethical people that Hubbard talks about, and that's that automatically is othering everybody else. So I thought just as an immediate lob at it, that's one thing it's doing. And it because it gives you a false sense of superiority, right? It was introduced to me with the metaphor of the knights of old. This is the honorable. That when you act with integrity, you are living by a code. Knights used to live by a code, and so therefore we should too. So that's kind of how I got it given to me when I was a young Scientologist. What was your experience with it?
But it didn't come to me in that way. But yes, it's a code of chivalry.
Yeah,
that's
that's the word.
Which came to me as a separate subject after I'd left Scientology. I became interested in Joseph Campbell's work and read about a dozen of his books. They're Masks of God, and he gets into this thing about the legends of King Arthur being a very vital thing during the Middle Ages in terms of setting a code of honor, a moral way of being. And knowing enough about history and adding to that, I then went and read them all. I read Chrétien de Troyes, who in the 12th century writes the first of these things. I got into the history of it. King Arthur was, if he existed at all, a 6th century Romano-Briton who fought off the invasions of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. There may have been a battle at a place called Prestonpans in that time. All of the rest, 300 years later, somebody mentions Arthur. That's it. There's nobody with him, no Guinevere, no Lancelot, none of that stuff. 300 years after it happened. And then a couple of hundred years after that, Richard the Lionheart's sister, Maud of Champagne, commissions Chrétien de Troyes to write these wonderful stories. And, fragments of them have survived that they'd come out of particularly Welsh traditions, Briton traditions, and they're written down. And of course, inevitably what happens is they're then made better. And you get Parsifal, written by Wolfram in somewhere around 1210. I wrote a novel, which I still haven't published, based upon Parsifal. And I thought it was going to be this. Oh, yeah. So I've written 9 novels. I have 2 in print. But I got this idea that you could base a video game on this wonderful story. Now, Parsifal is the young country bumpkin who his mum dresses him up, puts him on a donkey, and off he goes thinking he's a great knight. And he defeats the Red Knight in a joust. So he can take the Red Knight's charger and his lance and his armor. And he then rides into the camp of the Round Table. And they all think he's a buffoon. And he gets sent off. And of course, the interesting, I mean, eventually Wagner will write an opera about this. Um, the funny thing is, when you think about it, he's the guy that finds the Holy Grail.
Right. And he's the bumbling fool they all reject.
Yeah. And he's not
Right.
really a knight. But so these
It's
ideas,
sort of the Rudolph story.
well, yeah,
or vice versa. I mean, the underdog, right, ends up saving the day kind of thing.
yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, Wolfram's version of it, and Wolfram was a crusader. He wasn't a poet. He's somebody who'd been and bashed people on the head for real. And
Yeah.
so he writes this, very manly sort of story about this wonderful warrior. And it's a great story, and it's inspired many things. The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, for example,
Mm,
or The
mm,
Fisher King by Terry
mm.
Gilliam, a great film.
Yeah.
The
Remember the
Fisher
movie?
King is Amfortas, who is a character in The Story of Parsifal. The thing is, they get ever more elaborate, these stories. Mallory adds Excalibur the sword. We get Lancelot and Guinevere added along the way, century on century on century. The idiots who wrote the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which becomes Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, they don't bother to study the history and the evolution of these stories. And then, of course, with Tennyson at the end of the 19th century, you get the Morte d'Arthur, and you get the whole court of Queen Victoria dressing up in costumes and having these Arthurian balls and all of this stuff. And inside it is this code of chivalry,
Yeah.
and it never actually happened. These people were thugs. They lived by hurting other people. And what's at the center of it, which doesn't come out, is the court of love, which is basically the idea of trying to get off with somebody else's wife. This isn't, and what Campbell tries to take from that, tries to push all of that aside and say, look, your loving relationship is the most religious thing you'll ever have. The relationship you have with your intimate other, that is the most spiritual thing you'll ever experience, which is quite a good idea. But he didn't have children. I've got four
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
But yes,
Yeah.
Hubbard is building upon this idea of a chivalric code,
That's it.
whereby we ought to live.
That's right.
And as you say, he starts by saying no one expects the code of honor to be closely and tightly followed. Okay. An ethical code cannot be enforced. Yes, it can. Any effort to enforce it's called the law.
Exactly.
Any effort to enforce the code of honor would bring it into the level of a moral code. Now, I used to always get stuck with this, that when I looked at what ethics isn't morals, ethics is pro-survival. There is no satisfactory differentiation between ethics and morals in Scientology. Goodness
It's
and bad.
kind of ethics is your thing and morals is the group thing, as though they're two completely different things. And from Hubbard's point of view, it makes sense because for him, life was a struggle of constantly wanting his will to be manifest and everyone else telling him he couldn't. It was very Trumpian in a way, actually. It's just
And
sort of, I don't recognize all of you people trying to impose your guidelines on me. So I'm just going to keep pushing the boundaries and pushing the boundaries and pushing the boundaries because that's where I'm coming from. And that was Hubbard's basic take on ethics and morals, as far as I could tell.
well, he was a solipsist. He was a full-on
Yeah.
temporal lobe epileptic, who thought that we were just creatures of his imagination, as he said in the Philadelphia doctorate course.
He's the game maker.
He's the game maker. That's exactly the one. The player has to keep the rules from the pieces. So David Miscavige mustn't let anybody know that the rule is give us all your money. That's the fundamental rule of Scientology.
That's right.
And
That's right.
your children and anything else. And David Miscavige hasn't realized, or maybe he has, Hubbard was the game maker. And what Hubbard says about the game maker is the game maker doesn't have to follow the rules. Now, and just flipping through the book that I've got my code of honor in, I bought this in 1975 when you were knee high to a grasshopper.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And of course, we have the famous, and I can quote it from memory, Axiom 31. Goodness and badness, beautifulness and ugliness are alike considerations and have no other basis than opinion. So goodness and badness have no other basis than opinion, just as Aleister Crowley said.
That's right.
Before him. Right. So what is ethics? What would be moral? What would be ethical if good and bad don't exist? And I accept there are value judgments that we each make individually, and what's good for the spider I just trod on, that might be good for me. It wasn't very good for the spider. So I do accept that, and I would normally put it in a glass and put it outside, but my wife's really quite frightened of them. So what's good for, it's like environmentalists are saying you've got to preserve all of the species. And I don't want to preserve mosquitoes,
Right.
tsetse flies, let's get rid of them. And I don't care what that does to the universal pecking order.
Right.
So that determination of, he's almost trying to say that ethics is something that applies to all of life. It's being pro-survival, and morals is something that's about goodness and badness, and they don't really exist. They do really exist. We have a thing called the law, which we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which says killing people is, well, generally bad.
Generally.
And, unless the government tells you to do it, in which case it's good.
That's right.
There are exceptions to these rules. As he says, you can't be closely and tightly followed. It depends on who's in charge. But we get into these stupid ideas, and Scientology certainly subscribes to them. It takes two to tango. That if something happens to you, it's because you did something wrong. So that we don't need the law, we don't need the police, because it all works itself out. It's like the free market economy. You just it'll just work itself out. The murderers will. It's because
That's
people
right.
want to be murdered and they've pulled it in that they're being murdered. And you go, no, I am not going to subscribe to this Bronze Age simplistic view of Karma Vipaka, because it doesn't make any sense. I would rather there were protections against psychopathic monsters.
That's right. And that's where we have culture and society. And this is where the people, the narcissists, lose their mind. They really lose the plot because they can't live a life that fits into the guardrails that the rest of us subscribe to so that we can coexist safely. This is where they feel impinged upon, stopped. You're taking away my freedoms and my rights because I just want to be able to hurt anybody anytime I want. And how dare you? And this is their idea. And it comes from a moral base of might is right. And that concept is physically true when you can enforce it, but morally bankrupt as a principle because it is all about coming down to one lone survivor who beats everybody else. And then, hey, great, the world's yours, chump. Now what? Like, there's no end game to might is right that results in any kind of good, you could say, as we conceive the concept at a social level. It's always a destructive end. So that moral philosophy, while physically justifiable or rationalizable, doesn't ever go anywhere constructive for everybody, which is why most people look at that and go, that looks a little crazy to me.
Isaiah Berlin had it down to liberty for wolves is death for sheep.
There we go. There we go.
And there's our problem. I mean, Donald Trump, our esteemed, or your esteemed leader, has told us that there are only two kinds of people. There are predators and there is prey. Now,
That's right.
as soon as I heard him say that, and it was before he was re-elected, I kind of went, you're an extraordinarily dangerous human being then, because I'm not prey and I'm not a predator.
That's right.
And I think that if that's a simplistic way of viewing the world, then what you're saying is, well, and he did say it'll be dictatorship from day one. Authoritarianism. I just today recorded a thing with Steve Hassan, and you get to this thing of, I switched wording when I first wrote the book that's now called Opening Our Minds. I talked about totalists and totalitarians. I've just had somebody who's doing a PhD using it remind me of this, because I said, you need the new edition. He said, no, you say authoritarian in the later editions. And it was like, well, yeah, I thought about it. I said, it's not just total authoritarians, which is what totalitarian means. It was first applied to Mussolini. So, he actually had a word invented for him. Lucky man. And it's not just total authoritarians I'm bothered with. It's the whole concept of authoritarianism, that some people get to bully us and we don't get to make choices. And where Steve was talking about, getting away from the authoritarianism that is taking over in the United States at the moment, sadly, I was saying, well, but we've never really had a persistent human society that was not authoritarian. Our education system, our supposed democracies are, as a Tory politician called Lord Hailsham said, they are elective dictatorships. You elect people to be the dictators for 4 or 5 years.
That's right.
In your country, 5 years.
That's right.
And it's sort of, yeah, let's see if we can get further than this. And this has got nothing to do with being left or right or, socialist was a word that came from Bismarck, who was running an empire. And it means providing enough for everyone, socialism. It means everyone gets food, education, and, somewhere secure to live. That's the concept that people are fighting against when they fight against socialism. Say, no, there should be some people who live in misery.
And the horror story is that there are human beings who actually live their lives feeling that that's true.
Yes,
and that's what we're fighting against, right? At the end of the day, is this basic idea of no, everybody doesn't deserve to live, actually, and that is a horrible, horrible place to be.
Yeah, and there is enough for everyone. If we weren't wasting, authoritarianism, there have been 1,800 nuclear tests. Russia just added another one last week. Wow. 1,800. It's like, look, if you couldn't get it to work the first time.
Exactly. Come on, guys. Come on.
And that, of course, has irradiated our atmosphere. So there isn't anybody alive who doesn't have a radioactive particle that came from one of those tests.
Exactly.
And it's not doing you any good. So
not at all.
This kind of, when the Buddhists, if you ask the Buddhists, how did it all begin? They say beginningless greed. And it is. And that's narcissism, that's greed, that's I, me, my, mine. And we should be better than that by realizing that we aren't super beings. And, we should be better than that. And we should look towards, again, as in Holds Up book again, in this book, I make the argument that no, we are not all siblings. We are, but we are all cousins. And genetically, that's provable. And our ancestors were black, whichever way you want to look at it.
No getting around it.
As Pete Townsend said, I look all white, but my dad was black. Bless him. So how do we then impose this code? Let's look at what we've got. The first point, never desert a comrade. There's a Russian communist word. Comrade.
I know, right?
Never desert a comrade in need, in danger, or in trouble. What do we think about that? I think it's not a bad idea,
It's interesting, right? Because it sounds noble. Sounds courageous. I'm not going to desert you when you're in need, right? Sounds very friendly, very solidarity. But
this is actually referring to?
Exactly. There's a very interesting twist of language throughout this code that I'm going to point out first, right? Which is that Hubbard uses extreme or binary language. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points of this code start with the word never. Never is a very dangerous word because it means not at any time, under any circumstances, in any way, shape, or form, should this ever occur. There is no exception to this. And you better be pretty sure when you're talking about things like that, when you get to absolutes, because even Hubbard said,
absolutes are unobtainable.
That's it. All right. And then he demands 7 of them from you as an ethical code.
So you don't actually have to do this.
So I just want to point out, just mechanically speaking right now, if you're a Scientologist and you buy into this code and you buy into Scientology and the axioms, some of the most fundamental Scientology basics there are, you have been introduced to 7 double binds right away. Just that alone, right? So I just want to point that one out first.
And let's open out the idea of the double bind. This was something that I explored deeply in Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker about 10 years ago. That if you want to paralyze somebody into indecision, as L. Ron Hubbard points out, you you give them contradictions.
Yep.
So,
That's right.
and the whole of Scientology is based on this two-terminal thing. There's plus and minus. Now, actually, that's not a complete description of the universe. It does describe electrical and magnetic polarity, but it does not describe everything that human beings are capable of. But he fixes people into this plus or minus. And then, of course, on the old secret levels from R6 through the old clearing course, the original OT1, OT2, you've got all of these terminals and opposition terminals. Everything is reduced to be or not to be.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and you are trapped between them. And Scientology itself, which is a series of implants, of course, that's the way to think of it, that what Hubbard is doing is Scientology is an implant station where you are paying money to actually be programmed into having a deficient intellectual system, which will not help you govern the world and will make you loathsome to other people.
That's right.
Other people won't want to have, most of my friends abandoned me when I got into Scientology. It's like, he won't stop bloody talking about Scientology. He's trying to recruit us.
That's
They
right.
they know that that's all that's going on. And I was doing it with the best of intentions because I thought I was giving them this wonderful thing. But they were bored as heck after the first 10 minutes.
Exactly. I ran into the same things,
Mhm.
same things. And just to go a little deeper on this particular first point, never
Yeah.
desert a comrade in need, in danger, or in trouble. So your best friend shows up at your door one night and says, I got into this horrible situation and I ended up committing sexual assault against this woman.
Would you give me an alibi?
Would you give me an alibi? Exactly. Don't desert me now. I'm in
Oh.
trouble.
Mm,
I'm a sex offender. And I just happen to be somebody, you're related to or know.
mm,
Well, never, ever desert any of your comrades, right? So, guess what you're stuck with? I mean, this is what I mean by context. This is always what I mean by this
mm,
is you can always dream up, or rather, if you can, and you should really challenge yourself to do so, when you're presented with things like never, always, these kinds of nonsensical statements
mm,
that very, very rarely, I'm talking about 0.00001% of the time, maybe there might be some validity to it. That's how rare absolutes are. So somebody starts throwing these things at you, and they are a dime a dozen amongst cult gurus. Always this, never that.
mm,
So here's, somebody throws that at you. Always question, okay, where would I use this? How would this work? How would this work? Is there some way this would work that I wouldn't like, that wouldn't work out that way? I would want to desert that guy. I would want, he might be in need, but you know what? It ain't my need, right? Like there are circumstances like that. This is what we call
and
judgment.
mm. And it's in conflict with the eight dynamics. The idea that you must assess every situation as it applies to
There we go.
what's good for you, what's good for you. And so with this guy, reasoning would say, okay, he's come to the door, he's committed a sexual offense. We need to get you the best lawyer we can.
Yeah.
That's the help I'm going to give you. The other thing that is underlying this is comrade number one, the most important comrade in the world is Lafayette Ronald Hubbard. Never desert Ron. Not
Got it.
not ever,
You got
And
it.
then you look at the crimes that were committed on his behalf. One of the things I bring up yet again in the new book is what happened to the cartoonist Berry. That they found, when the Guardian's office raids happened in 77, biggest raids in the history of the FBI, they found orders from Hubbard to destroy the career of this cartoonist because there's a cartoon and he basically says, I was into TM and I was into the Krishnas and I was into Scientology, but now I'm into money and there's a pile of money. And just for saying that, this man's life was to be destroyed.
That's right. That's right. That's the level of psychosis we're talking about with these cult leaders.
Yeah.
And so when you start subscribing to their moral code, you have to really like in this after cult process. I bring these things up because I really feel it's in our best interest to really think hard about what we subscribe to when we were in the group, because sometimes we hold on to those things as
Mhm.
habits.
Yeah.
and that's why these reviews are always so useful. I mean, rolling right into number two, which has the exact same sort of core theme to it that the first three really do, and it's all about loyalty, which is really the currency of the realm when it comes to narcissistic predatory personalities. They really obsess on that concept of loyalty. And Hubbard bakes it into this thing with number two, never withdraw allegiance once granted. Of course, allegiance being the same thing as loyalty. It's not just friendship, it's not just kindness or compassion or empathy, it's allegiance. That is a strong word.
Mm.
And it does hearken to the chivalry and the ages of old with this sort of commitment idea. I'm a formal ally, you could say, allegiance.
Mm.
So fine, never withdraw allegiance once granted doesn't, kind of gives you this sort of on the good side of this. You think to yourself, oh yeah, keep your commitments, honor your responsibilities or obligations to your relationships. Nothing wrong with that. That sounds all good, but
However,
never withdraw. Okay, now we're stuck to every single relationship we've ever made or any allegiance we've ever offered. What if my company, I find out, is dumping toxic chemicals in the river across the way? I'm supposed to stay allegiant to this company?
mm,
What I immediately, again, the context, the examples start coming up of, well, maybe this isn't such a good idea.
yeah, that
That's
it's and it is something in our society that's really awful that whistleblowers are attacked.
oh, oh God,
Um,
right? They
and
just get a shellacking from people.
yep, and I've been there, and
Mm,
so there is this protection of the group. When you find out that your church has been doing this, there's there's endless covering up because you mustn't withdraw your allegiance. No, your allegiance, it's like with in the US at the moment that the allegiance is actually to the Constitution, not to
bingo.
the president.
That's
And
right.
that seems a proper
That's right.
use of
That's
an
it.
allegiance
That
to say,
that's exactly the differentiation that has allowed American power to be non-authoritarian for so long, and what these guys are struggling so hard to tear apart is that exact point of where does the loyalty lie?
yeah.
Yeah.
Should we go to point three? The
Yeah,
other
let's.
next thing we must never do,
This one, never desert a group to which you owe your support, which really is pretty much number two reworded.
which was pretty much number one reworded.
Pretty much. I
And why
mean,
do you owe your support? I mean, you will owe quite a lot of money if you're in Scientology generally, but why would you? How is this allegiance, uh, you know, this need to, once you've made a commitment, you've got to stick by it. And as you say, when you realize that you've committed to something that's negative and destructive, it doesn't mean that you should become negative and destructive, but
that's
you've
right.
got to think through not what's best for the eight dynamics, because that's a ridiculous nonsense. One vote for a person and one vote for 8 billion people. And
Right.
if God doesn't like it and you believe in God, then the fact the other seven, just there's no adding this thing up. It was just a
No,
silly thought that he had when he was sat reading the boy's own book of wisdom one day. Um, but how do you come to owe your support to the group? This is quite interesting. How do you owe your support to? Because the group that we're talking about here is Scientology, isn't it? I'm pretty sure.
that's right. That's right.
So you owe your support to us because we're honourable. Well, you only owe your support if they are honourable. And while I have heard it said that Scientology is the most ethical group on the planet. There's this great letter when Steve Kinane was researching Fair Game, brilliant history, and very funny in places, a brilliant history of Scientology in Australia. He came and interviewed me. We were at a conference in Copenhagen. He flew from Australia and interviewed me, and he said, "I've got this letter," and it was to the police chief of some place with an interesting Aborigine name like Wagga Wagga or something. And it was a personal letter from L. Ron Hubbard that he'd found in the files of the Anderson inquiry. So it was a signed L. Ron Hubbard letter in which he said, "You're investigating this person for criminal acts. And I can assure you, he's a Scientologist. A Scientologist would never commit a crime. And you can believe me because I was the provost marshal of Korea," which is to say, the head of the military occupation of Korea after World War II.
Come on.
He'd never been to Korea in his life. He spent 4 weeks training at the Princeton School of Military Government to go in as the Japanese were defeated. Found out that the Japanese were resisting to the last man, woman, and child. So it was really dangerous, and got ulcers and said, "I went to Princeton."
Oh, come on. These guys. Well, those are your first those and one other thing to mention about this, because I think it's important. It's not just a character flaw. I think it's an organizational systemic flaw when it comes to religious gurus imparting their wisdom from on high in the most hypocritical way that they can. And Hubbard is such a brilliant example of that with these first 3 points, because we can ask ourselves one very simple question when we look at the life of L. Ron Hubbard. Who was L. Ron Hubbard loyal to? No one. Not
No
one person.
and
Even his wife got thrown under the bus.
his third wife, after the
That's right.
first two
Third
had been
wife.
thrown under it. Yes,
After
the thought that
yeah.
Mary Sue Hubbard went to prison for a year because she was offered the choice by the prosecution of not confessing, in which case Ron Hubbard would be found and would be tried, or confessing, in which case he would be cited, along with Kendrick Moxon, head of their legal department. He'd be an unindicted co-conspirator, which is what they decided on. She went to prison so that he wouldn't have to. And then when she came out of prison, she wrote letters to him. And I've talked with somebody who was on the line there. And Hubbard had given an order that there must be no en theta. There must be nothing negative in these letters. And so they were photocopied backside and front side so that they could separate them. And then a razor blade was taken to anything that was a complaint or, a disagreement or anything like that. And so he kept getting these letters, and they said, "Dear Ron, love Mary Sue."
Exactly.
He refused to see her, and she'd gone to prison for him. And he tossed his oldest son, Nibs, Ron Hubbard Jr., for 7 years, he was his father's enforcer. He gave us the upper indoctrination training routines.
Yeah.
They just took Junior off with Tipex when they reissued them. He was there for his father. And then eventually in 1959, he went to his dad and said, "Look, I've got all these kids and I can't afford to feed them. Could I have a bit more money?" And Ron Hubbard said, "No." So he left. And then it was, let's get him. And talking with one of Nibs's sons there at Toronto, saying every time Nibs answered the door, he had a gun behind his back. Yeah. Because the Guardian's office, under the direction of his own father, were there to terrify and silence him, and quite possibly, if they could, kill him.
That's right. And
that's his own son. When Quentin, the son of the third marriage, dies, he complains about it being bad public relations. That's his first response to hearing that his own child has died. Never desert a comrade in need, in danger, right, in trouble. Never withdraw allegiance. Never desert a group to show your support. And then you go through the list of people who were really close to him from the start. Dr. Joseph Winter, who, of course, was there when Dianetics was written. It was him, Don Rogers, Sarah Northrup. So you get the attack on Sarah Northrup. There are people dead because they opposed us, including Joe Winter. People dead because they opposed us. Of course, we didn't kill him. Yeah, right.
So Ron Hubbard's words, he actually said those things in lectures. I've heard him say it.
Yeah. And, when Don Purcell rescued him from bankruptcy and set him up in Wichita in 1951, He wrote 31 letters. He had a guy called James Elliott steal the mailing lists of the Wichita Foundation. They'd had this falling out, apparently because Hubbard had come to decide that he was going to have past lives, just like Aleister Crowley with the magical memory. He was going to include this. And Purcell went, no, that's stupid. I'm not doing it. And so off went Hubbard. And then he realized he'd sold Dianetics so that he wouldn't have to go into court for the bankruptcies. Purcell, for $800, had bought it all back. The court had said, oh, you can have it for $800. So he now owned the name Dianetics. He owned the book Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health.
Yeah.
And Hubbard had got nothing left. And he has his guy, James Elliott, and I've got letterhead with James Elliott, business manager, Oren Hubbard on it. He has him go and steal the mailing lists from the Wichita Foundation. And he sent 31 letters, and I have copies of them, to all of the people on that mailing list attacking Don Purcell, causing him a money.
Within a year, this all happens.
Not Mountebank.
This all happens within a year of Purcell saving Hubbard's ass. Right? Like beginning of 1951, Hubbard was out of it. And then he, I mean, the whole history, we've gone over it, he kidnaps Alexa, goes down to Cuba.
July 51, he goes off to Cuba. He kidnaps his own daughter, threatens to tear her into pieces and throw her in the river if his wife won't give him the divorce he wants. Who was he ever loyal to? Who was with him?
That's right.
At St. Hill, you've got all of those tapes where he's talking about Reg.
Red Sharp, that's right.
Red Sharp was still alive. Red Sharp was living in one of the cottages facing St. Hill when I left. And he was, people go to him, well, surely, you don't want to be here anymore. He's like, he can leave, I'm not. And this was, oh, dear Reg, my great friend Reg. He maintained no friendships. Captain Bill Robertson, who was the second deputy commodore, declared suppressive and thrown out. And Miscavige takes over, and the weird thing there is he was never a friend of Oren Hubbard. He was just a cameraman.
That's right. Never friends. It's interesting, and it needed to be said because these violations of this supposed code of honor were so egregious and so repeated on the part of Hubbard, right, over and over and over again. Just the first 3 points, right, where he lays in with this, as he liked to say, with an atomic branding iron, he lays in these points that, that loyalty and allegiance are the highest values you can have as in a moral system. Note, not empathy, not compassion, no, loyalty. Right. So I think we've made the point probably 10 times over, but I think it's an important point to make that in the eyes of a narcissist, of course, the repeated demands in an ethical code are going to be, you better stay loyal to me. He only puts it 3 different ways. So we've got that to start with. And it's really not clear to Scientologists when they're in that wild glow of membership, thinking that they are the exalted, superior people. And I was there. That's how I get to talk about this way, right? My head, I mean, man, to the moon, right? So you get all full of yourself reading this. I did. I got very full of myself with this. I'm so great because I'll never leave. I'm so allegiant. I'm so loyal, right?
And then look what happened.
And then look what happened, exactly. So that's just to kind of put the headspace there a little bit, right? As to what I think is actually going on here with this code in the minds of Scientologists. So those are your first 3 points. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this next section, which is sort of points, the next 3 points really. There gets more over into points of emotional detachment and self-sufficiency. These next points, I kind of categorize them. We've got number 4, never disparage yourself or minimize your strength or power. Interesting point. What are your thoughts on this one to lead us on this one?
Get this big book here.
Never
not going to disparage myself. This is the one of the 2 volumes of the shorter Oxford English Dictionary, and let's just make sure we've cleared the word before we go any further. What does he mean by disparage? And he did at least tell us that we could use the dictionary, the definition,
Hmm.
if it wasn't one of the 1,200 pages of redefinitions that he gave in his own.
Indeed.
Disproperty, disprivilege,
Let's see here.
displenish. There's a good word.
Hmm.
Disparage. Disparagement. To disparage. Middle English.
Hmm.
To match unequally, to degrade
Hmm.
by an unequal match, to lower in esteem, to lower in position or dignity, to cast down, to treat slightingly, to undervalue, to vilify. So basically, don't say anything bad about yourself. Well, sorry, self-deprecation is fundamental to my culture. And if you can't do that, you're an arrogant twat. So
Not
there,
to mention,
there's that one.
perfect. I will add to that under this last bit of minimizing your strength or power. Again, this is really where the word never at the beginning of this thing is doing an awful lot of work. And I'm going to push back hard because that word is there. Walking around talking about with an inner monologue of how powerful and awesome and amazing you are is certainly something we all do and need to do as part of our little ego boosting and that kind of thing when we're kind of down or having, the various, times in our life. But this idea of never minimizing your strength or power, I mean, it's not that hard to take that and go, wait a minute. So if I'm playing a game with a kid, I can't ever let him win. If I'm, if I'm involved in some kind of power dynamic, I can't ever take the lesser position in grace to or compassion for somebody else. I always have to be the guy who's the powerful, the strong. And I think to myself, I say this as a criticism because I think to myself of how Hubbard thought. And that kind of is how Hubbard thought. Hubbard wouldn't have had any problem at all, you know, uh, dashing a child's hopes, to show off how strong or powerful he was. He did it to his children all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, the
there's
man was a rampant child abuser. So
the small amount of time that he spent with his children.
exactly.
Yeah, and
Exactly.
you can turn that round to never be willing to accept you were wrong, never be willing to criticize yourself,
That's
and
right.
you go, oh, this is actually a definition of the sociopathic personality, that
Bingo.
and
That's right.
not reducing your power. Let's say that you're just about to stop somebody from doing something wrong and you hit them as hard as you possibly can, according to this, rather than using, you know, the amount of force that is necessary.
That's right.
It's yeah, silliness, which
It,
leads
it
to
it opens itself up to some abusive behavior, and with a little bit of, like I said, even if you just read it innocently and casually, it instills an overabundance of confidence or certainty in self that is not warranted by a human experience. There are times in our lives where every single one of us needs to disparage ourselves and look honestly at what we're doing because we're screwing up and we're messing up a relationship, we're messing up a job, we're messing up our kid, we're doing something that we need to stop and go, hang on a second, maybe I'm the one who's wrong here. This is 24/7 human beings all over the world. If you don't have that capacity and within yourself to do that, or you run around thinking I should never do that, then you're never going to have a moment or ounce of compassion or humility or be able to own your own mistakes. And
yeah,
I don't think that's an exaggerated reading of this. I just wanted to throw that out there.
and we could replace the code by saying grow up and make your own rules. You know, don't be told what to do by some bloke who's ripping you off. That would be a good
Exactly.
rule.
That would
Um,
be a good.
and and what you say about the voice in people's head, I want to point out that there has actually been some work done on this. That there are people who have a positive voice in their head, and there are people who have a negative voice in their head.
Mm.
And I'm always doing that. Oh, I'm so bad, what have you. When I was reading about this a few years ago in the psychological study had been done, I was kind of going, I don't have those voices in my head. I really don't. Nothing speaks to me. Something happens and I think about it and I go, is that right or is that wrong? Often after I've said something, so probably too often, but often after I've said something, I think, that wasn't very clever, was it really? Or that sounded really pompous, or what have you. But I have this my dialogue is very immediate. Some of it's negative, some of it's positive. And so yeah, the idea of not being allowed to say sorry, or I got that wrong, or I misspoke. You're not allowed to do that, it would seem, because you'd be disparaging yourself. I mean,
he's using the word never. Never.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
never ever.
again, it's a heavy word, right? So I gotta take it from as he wrote it. That's what he wrote, so I think that's what he meant. And no, that's just not a good piece of advice.
This policy means exactly what it says.
Exactly. All right, so let's combine 5 and 6 because they kind of go together. We got this never need praise, approval, or sympathy. A very interesting set of words there, which goes right along with number 6. Never compromise with your own reality. Um, a lot of Scientologists will start bringing in the ARC triangle on these points because of the word reality, and I know affinity comes up in the next one, but this praise, approval, or sympathy is interesting because when you read Hubbard's affirmations, you tend to see a concentrated amount of attention on Hubbard's part on these 3 things, and a deep vacuum within himself of a need for these because he wasn't ever getting enough. It almost screams at you when you go through the affirmations that Hubbard.
Just first, for anybody who's not familiar, the affirmations were hypnotic affirmations, hypnotic suggestions that Hubbard wrote to himself in the 1940s, and they're extensive. Jerry Armstrong rescued them from the cult, and Chris has examined them in some significant detail, which needs to be done because they are foundational to Scientology. And what we find is this desperately unhappy man. The letter that he wrote asking for psychiatric treatment is reprinted in my book, Scientology, The Cult of Greed, which is very cheap and you should rush out and buy it. But you've got this whole letter of this pathetic man who's like, he can't escape his suicidal inclinations. He can't rise above his these morbid feelings he has, and he's asking for treatment and he didn't get it. Which, who knows what might have happened. But there he is very much saying, I need this. And when I interviewed John McMaster, the world's first real clear, as Hubbard declared him in 1965, McMaster was very close to Hubbard. He spent a lot of time with Hubbard at St. Hill in 65, 66. And he said there were so many times he'd come off a stage with everybody cheering and applauding what he'd said, and Hubbard would be sat there glowering. And he'd even go into his office sometimes and he'd be crying because nobody had applauded him. I was told that at the end of his life, the most important statistic, as far as Hubbard was concerned, was how long was his photograph applauded at the end of an event. How much does it never need praise, approval, or sympathy?
There you go.
Well, okay.
And that's actually really a great anecdote. Let me just say this real fast. Because how many of us in Scientology, especially through the late 80s and 90s, got so kind of just, Jesus, is this really, we're going to do this again? Another standing ovation, another, we got to get out of our seats. 5 times, 10 times during these events when Miscavige is on stage. And always, of course, when it's, praise of Hubbard, it's praise of Miscavige, which becomes praise of Hubbard, right? That was the sequence of how the applause would go. And it would have to happen at least 10 times every 2-3 hour event.
And I left before Miscavige took over, so I was really lucky.
Yeah, you really were, man, because I'm telling you, it was notable and it was unique to Scientology. There wasn't anything else in my life I'd ever been part of that had that component, and it was and all of us would just be kind of Jesus again. So even when you're in the headspace, it was taken to this extreme place.
Mm.
And I really do believe, as I sit here right now, that it all comes from the insecurity and and sort of need that Hubbard and then Miscavige both have for praise, approval, and sympathy. This is
Yeah,
their
yeah.
codependency. This is where the cult leader codependency lives. Is they all need praise, approval, and sympathy because they didn't get it as kids or whatever. I mean, I don't know
Well,
why
no, they
they
got too
did
much
it,
of it as
or they
kids.
got, yeah,
I think Hubbard, having talked to Ron Miscavige, David Miscavige's dad, the late great, I think he got plenty of love when he was a kid.
yeah,
And
funny,
and talking, the interview that Russell Miller did with Margaret Roberts, who was Hubbard's aunt, 8 years older than him, until he was 12. He was living much of the time in the same house as her. He got lots of praise, lots of
yeah,
approval, lots of sympathy. So constructing how and why he turned out the way he did, it's very hard to do
yeah,
because it's like the idea of eugenics, that if you breed people, then you'll get this thing. Well, do people understand that David Bowie and Einstein both had a sibling who was schizophrenic? Do people understand that James Joyce, who was considered for a long time to be the greatest novelist of the 20th century, had a daughter who was schizophrenic? How are we going to do these simplistic things? And in the same way that there are people who are vicious psychopaths who come out of perfectly good homes.
that's
It's
right.
not and there are people who are really decent, really profoundly decent people who come out of the most awful backgrounds. So,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly. It's not 100% one or the other
and,
as far as that whole
and, it,
nature nurture thing.
and as you know, I'm very fond of Eric Fromm's ideas, many of them. And the malignant narcissist, what is now called the narcissistic personality disorder, is one of the few things that psychiatrists agree on that came from a single source, from this man, Eric Fromm. And Eric Fromm said, well, narcissism, originally Havelock Ellis, the English psychologist, came up with the word, meaning somebody who does not want to have sex with other people. This last week, I actually saw somebody misquoting and saying he said it was because they masturbate excessively. No, he didn't say they were narcissists for that reason. There are no Greek images of somebody masturbating. The images, well, maybe there are. In fact, there probably are actually. But it's somebody who's looking into the bondage himself. He's not interested in anybody else. That's what
right.
narcissism means. Then
Yeah.
Freud came along and turned it round and said it's somebody who loves themselves excessively. And then Eric Fromm came along, having studied Freud in depth, and said, no, narcissism is somebody who does not know how to love. And that need for praise, approval, and sympathy, that need for adulation. And yeah, let's mention the President of the United States and look at that cabinet going, you are the most beautiful president there's ever. I mean, yeah, this thing with Hegseth where he said, right, all you generals have got to do push-ups. He said, who came on the stage after you? Commander-in-Chief. Come on, stop eating all of those burgers and let's see you do some exercise. But the narcissist laps up. They have no identity. They can't become adults. They can't become human beings because they can't develop an identity because they have to have praise, approval, and sympathy at every step of the way. There have been many contributions, all of them minor, as L. Ron Hubbard said of the rest of us. The only person who could discover anything about how to resolve the human condition, the only person who've done anything in 50,000 years, according to him, in the fundamental thought. It's like, oh, come on, guy. This is somebody who desperately needs praise, approval, and sympathy.
Oh, and that's actually the point. That's the key point. And that's also, of course, what comes out of the of reading the affirmations, which are really your only real serious microscope into L. Ron Hubbard's personality and who he really was. Between that and your Lucifer bulletin, I think you have some real nice bookmarks there for who this guy was. And it's
my only goal is to smash my name into history. 1938 was first one.
That's right. So you have this this empty well, you could say, that Hubbard was trying to fill. And it was interesting because you could also see in the affirmations, this is another point of a very interesting struggle at a psychological level for people like Hubbard, which is that he also self-loathed and he also knew to a degree, and not all narcissists do, but Hubbard, I think, pretty clearly did know that he was a pretty fucked up guy and he was fighting himself all the time. There are some indications of that in some of the statements that he makes or the wording that he uses that indicates to me that he's struggled with some of these things and tried to, again, cognitive dissonance isn't something that I mean, narcissists can experience that. And he did in trying to sort out these values and ideas of, well, I should be praised, I should be approved, everybody should love me and fall down for me. And yet also I have these weaknesses and I'm not saying, and it was just like this constant struggle with him. And I think that, you know, a lot of this code, these hard word never, right? These absolute words that he starts throwing around, I think is his. You know, I need to stop this, right? Like he sees it as a weakness that he needs praise, approval, and sympathy, but he really compulsively can't stop seeking it, you know, and so there's an internal struggle there, I think, just worthy of commenting on, I think.
Absolutely. And like Aleister Crowley and following the directions of Aleister Crowley, he will at some point have self-harmed if he violated a principle. Crowley used to carry a razor blade to cut himself with, so that you were aligning your will so that you never do need this and you always do that, and you try and force yourself, punish and humiliate yourself into becoming this. And in both cases, of course, they became addicts.
That's right.
Crowley hanging cocaine.
That's
with
right.
Hubbard, there was certainly was Demerol, which is an opioid, which OT3 resulted from, and he was an alcoholic. We know that he was having serious problems with his alcohol consumption by the time he died. So they're very desperate people, as you say, they're trying to fake it.
That's right.
And, you know, pretend they've got this thing. So never compromise with your own reality. Never do anything that disagrees with what you believe, no matter how wrong you are. Okay, moving on.
Another one of these never words, right? Never lines. And this compromise with your own reality. I mean, how else are you supposed to learn? This is one of the things that hit me hardest about learning and this whole concept of integrity is that these two things are not mutually exclusive ideas. But when you start using or throwing words like never in there, then they become mutually exclusive. Then you suddenly can't let your guard down. You can't let anything in. What you are and who you are and how you see the world is the most ideal, perfect thing that it can be, because of course you would never compromise with your own reality. You know, like you start developing this kind of idea, and like OT7 develops narcissistic attitudes in people because of the way the auditing is done, practicing this develops narcissistic attitudes because of the way that it's worded, you know.
The Scientology is entirely to clone people on a narcissist. That's what all of the techniques are there to do, to elevate your own narcissism, your own sense of self-importance, your own selfishness. And it is cloning. You know, the Flavio Yakeley's discipling dilemma, when he studied, first of all, 900 members of the Boston Church of Christ and found they had the same personality profile, pretty much. And when he asked them what they wanted to be in 5 years' time, they all had exactly the same personality profile. Scientologists were in that study. And he found that they had another and different personality profile, but they were all the same. I think it was the Way International he did as well. Then he did 16 Christian communities and found that, I think it was 16, and found all of the personality types pretty much in them. So this cloning idea that and I feel that you cloned in two ways. One is you could be, as I sought to be. I was a customer, a member of the public. I cloned myself upon the ideal Hubbard. What would the ideal human being be like? And I very much realized he wasn't from the start, and that was really lucky. I realized he was fallible from the start
Mm,
because I caught him out before it even
right.
joined, because Himavesha had just come out, and I'm given these things saying he is Meteya. And I go to the Pali Text Society because I'm a Buddhist, and they say, no way, these prophecies don't exist. The
Yep.
Book of the Great Decease, the last book of the Digha Nikaya, which I have read, see, pompous, as I say. Um, the Book of the Great Decease probably wasn't written by the Buddha because it's about his death. And in it, there's this little idea that there might be somebody in the future. 2,500 years' time? No. Red hair? No. Will arise in the West? No. So I knew from the start that things were being claimed that weren't true. And that really helped. It meant I had 9 years of going, But I tried to clone myself upon what I thought was ideal. What I saw in the Sea organization was people cloning themselves upon the real. They were becoming like Hubbard. They were
Yep.
becoming monsters. When you hear about
Yeah.
his time at LINKTREE, and there's so many witnesses to that, in 1977, making the tech films, which David Miscavige has destroyed.
Yep.
The last great work of L. Ron Hubbard has been put away because it's so awful. Mark Headley had something to do with trying to rescue these terrible things, upon which millions were spent.
They were so
But he
bad.
gets caught up in this. Yeah, I saw one of them. It had David Mayo in the one I saw, in a fedora or a trilby or something, but dressed in like Jimmy Cagney, and saying, "Now, children, if this film is ever lost, you'll know what's happened. Scientology's been taken over." And a year later, David Mayo was gone. So never allow your deputy, who you've said is going to take over from you, to be declared suppressive. That's not in here.
So silly. So
Never
silly.
permit, never permit your. We're going to have to move along.
Yeah.
We're never going
Yeah.
to get to
Yeah.
them. Never permit your affinity to be a Lloyd.
To be alloyed. This was always
Lloyd.
one that screwed with me when I was in because of that word alloyed or alloyed. The idea of mixing it with other things to make some kind of, impure thing, right? And I was always never permit your affinity to be alloyed, right? Like, okay, so what, and we always kind of, I don't know what you guys resolve that to. For us, we always kind of resolved it to, well, don't let your bad feelings or your good feelings for somebody, affinity, right? Your love for someone to be corrupted or tainted or mixed up with, rumors or lies or, stuff like that. Or I don't know. Because we couldn't really get what else would you alloy your affinity with? What does that mean exactly? And to this moment, as I sit here right now, I'm really still not totally sure that I got what Hubbard meant with this. What do you think?
Well, to be stuck, to be fixed. So
Yes,
basically, if
okay.
you've tried to do numbers 1, 2, and 3 here, you shouldn't. You shouldn't do, because you never desert somebody. Well, if your affinity has become alloyed to that person, well, that should never happen. So you can desert anybody you like.
Oh, I get that.
Allegiance.
Oh, right,
Yeah, see,
right. Get it mixed
cognition.
up with.
Cognition.
Yeah, yeah,
Would you
yeah,
like
yeah.
to
I get the
attest?
flow. I get where you're coming from. Okay, okay. Yeah, yeah. And you're
Um,
right. It would be another double bind, wouldn't it?
and it most certainly is right there. Do
That
not give
says,
or receive. So we've had, reality,
yeah.
affinity. Now we've got to have communication. Do not give or receive communication unless you yourself desire it.
Yes.
What does that mean, Chris? Don't
Well,
talk to people unless you feel like it.
yeah, let me be clear because this is another one of those context is king things, right? Because this is rubbing right up against one of the most fundamental human rights that a person has, right? Which we reflect or talk about these days in terms of boundaries. But it's really this idea of, are you going to allow somebody else to come into your space or not? Are you willing to, or do you have to accept somebody else's communication if it comes your way, somebody else's relationship if it comes your way?
I just,
Well,
when somebody sends me a bill in the post, I just write on it and say, this violates my code of honor, and
there you
send it
go.
back to them.
Boom. out you go. No, obviously, I'm talking about in personal relationships, right?
But no, in
But
this case, it does actually say that you're taking communication that you don't want. How
yeah.
dare the electricity people want me to pay them money?
And that's where this goes exactly. So I can think of my point, of course, being I can think of contexts where it totally makes sense, but then come on, right? Like, yeah, IRS, go fuck yourself, right? It's not going to really work out so well for me if I'm following my code of honor that way. At least it doesn't say the word never. It just says do not. So
Yeah,
it
which means
slightly tones it down.
means exactly the same thing as never, but never mind, or do not mind. Your self-determinism and your honor are more important than your immediate life. Commit suicide for me.
Exactly. I don't know about this one, man.
What on earth
I
does it
mean,
mean?
it's absolutely, this is probably the one that leaps out at me the most
Mm.
as the one that Hubbard actually followed. Because Hubbard was willing to throw anyone under the bus if his self determinism and his own view of his quote unquote honor were in any way threatened.
Mm.
He'd get rid of them in a microsecond.
Mm.
And then on top of that, fair game them, right? I mean, there was almost nobody who got more fair gamed than Hubbard's own son. It's just disgusting who this man really was. So, it's one thing to go after Paulette Cooper, who he doesn't know. It's just some nameless, faceless journalist, and he orders her, to get her life ruined. And that's evil. That's horrible, horrible stuff. But to do that and more to your own son. Once I realized that, I was like, Hubbard just, I mean, it just kind of turned on a dime for me to realize that this man had no loyalty to anyone, which suddenly made the entire concept and worship of self-determinism in Scientology take on this very nefarious shade, because you see what Hubbard would do with his self-determinism, and how if anybody ever got in the way of, it impacted on his life in some fashion in an inconvenient way, well, get rid of him, get out of here, right? And it's so important to him that he have that right that he'd rather die than have to be held responsible for his obligations, like say to his kids.
Absolutely. And self-determinism, which is the objective of Scientology, to achieve full self-determinism. You then have, if you join his personal force, the Sea organization, that for 1 billion years under the code of a SEAL member, you promise to uphold and forward command intention.
That's right.
You promised for 1,000 million years to put aside your self-determinism. Now, the argument will be made that you're accepting pan-determinism, doing things for everyone by doing that, but you're not. You're putting aside your control over yourself. And how terrible, you're accepting it. Scientology is a form of psychological slavery. Plain and simple, it's a way of enslaving people psychologically. The Sea organization is a way of enslaving people physically.
That's right.
I'm annoyed this week, and I'm going to say it, and I keep saying it. I know I shouldn't say it, but I've just finished reading Jamie Mustard's book, Child X, which is about his abysmal, awful treatment as a baby and a child in Scientology. But he has a passage in it in which he says that former members are killing people like him, the born-ins. We are killing them by not recognizing their condition, by not having done anything to expose what's happening to them. Now, I talked with Jamie beginning of last year, and I explained, and he'd read A Piece of Blue Sky. And I said to him, when he said, nobody's said anything about this ever, I said that there's a chapter in Blue Sky about it, published in 1990. I wasn't the first to talk about it. The Clearwater hearings in 1982. This has been talked about, and it should be. But he says that former members are, unless they're born in, devils. And so we come to this perspective, which is one of these kind of code of honor type perspectives,
right?
This simplistic thinking that we're the enemy, not he's not trying to release the 4,000 slaves from Sea Org now. He's not trying to do anything. There's nothing in the whole book about opposing Scientology. In fact, the word Scientology is pretty much only used on the cover because
Wow.
the movement in the book,
Mm.
and he has machine-based counseling for
Oh,
hypnotic inductions. What is it?
no,
Yeah,
please, no.
and
No.
off we go. But to see that self-determinism, and this the the problem is that self-determinism has been fully violated, and that
That's
Hubbard
right.
never intended us to have any of it. He wanted us to
Exactly.
serve him.
Exactly. It was all for him. And that's the slaveholder mentality. And and that's why so much of Scientology is we describe it, I think accurately, as window dressing. It's rainbows and butterflies to distract you and think you're in an environment that you're really not in. And you're really, when you're actually in a prison, right? Certainly a psychological one.
Furthering the ends of Satan, according to the OT8 bulletin. That's what
Seriously.
Scientology is for. Lucifer, also known as Satan in the Bible.
Seriously. Yeah, it's that crazy. Now, number 10 is pretty much a restatement of this when he says
Mm.
your integrity to yourself is more important than your body.
Nothing's more important than my body, I tell you, really. I can't do a thing without it. I can't brush my teeth without it.
Well, apparently your integrity to yourself is more important, John. And I think again that the heavy lifting here is being done by the words to yourself when it comes
Mm.
to the twist in this. Because integrity is a word that applies to not just yourself. It's a social word. It's a word that has to do with your relationship with others. And the word literally goes back to the concept of integrating integrity.
Bringing
This is
everything together.
working with others in a way that you are providing a strong platform or base on which you can be relied upon. That's what integrity is, and it's something that other people weigh and measure. And so this idea that you have integrity to yourself is a true thing as to your own estimation of this, but yourself and your own view of it is only half the picture. And of course, Hubbard would put that in there because that's all he cares about is the own central view of self, but not what other people say or think. Sorry, you don't get integrity without other people weighing in. That's
Yeah.
the nature of the word. So again, another kind of little subtle double bind, a little subtle twist in there, but I think an important one that's the comment I wanted to make on this one.
Yeah. He is also saying that if you have to kill yourself on my behalf, that's the proper thing to do. If you have to give your life in support of the persistence of Scientology, that's the proper thing to do.
You got it.
And, my body is all I've got. Without it, I I'd be lost. Never regret yesterday. Life is in you today, and you make your tomorrow.
That's right. Let
Sounds
me
like a song lyric, doesn't that?
Oh, exactly. Let me back up a
Get
second
on
though
the
before we go to
road
this
to
one.
freedom. Sorry.
I got one more little statements to make on the last one because I've said this
Yep.
before, but I think it bears repeating right now on this point of killing yourself for the group. Because I made a big point here about integrity to yourself, and it's all how selfish it is. But let's remember that when I was in the cult, my interpretation of this was not all selfish and about myself. My thought was, as a Sea Org member, my integrity is as a Sea Org member. I'd so identified self with group that I was willing to kill myself for the group, which is exactly what L. Ron Hubbard wanted. I have actually said out loud a couple times in talks we've done, I would have taken a bullet from a scavenge. I thought about it. I knew I would do that. That wasn't like some maybe I would. And it fell under points like this that made me think that would be an ethical thing to do, right? Take a bullet for a predator. That's a great idea. Wonderful capstone to my life. So, all right. So, moving on here, as John just read out, never regret yesterday. Life is in you today, and you make your tomorrow. This is probably the one that people gravitate to the most because it tends to be the most forward thinking and maybe semi inspirational line that people have on this one. At least that was my feedback from other Scientologists to this. What was your experience with this one?
Yeah, it's fair enough. I think it is proper to regret yesterday. I
Hmm.
think if, let's say that you were Rudolf Höss on trial at Nuremberg, and you were asked the question, you, as commandant of Auschwitz, executed 1.25 million Jews, and your answer was executed and exterminated. And I quote exactly. Now, I think he should have regretted that.
I agree.
So I think if you've done something wrong and bad, you should regret it. I think if what's being said is don't live in regret, do
That's
something
right.
to make up for the wrong you've done. Absolutely, I advocate that. I think it could be better expressed, which is,
Completely.
pay something into society. Don't take your own life as a consequence of having realizing you've been evil. Do something good. Make up for what you've done. Oh, this is starting to sound like an ethics formula. Sorry. But making amends is a low tone thing. It's so confusing.
I know, right? Well, this is I failed to note that this one and also the next one also begin with these never words,
Oh, you love that
and
word.
you just know, you just know,
You
you
just
know.
always know
I just
that
don't. Yeah, exactly.
that never
Never
is.
believe anything that starts with the word never.
Exactly. Let's call that call the video that. Um, yeah, and my wife, who had the good fortune never to be involved in Scientology, read through these before we came on. While having dinner, and the one that got her was number 12. Never fear to hurt another in a just cause. And she said, "Okay."
Hmm.
I wonder
There
what
it
the
is.
just cause is.
That's right. How just would your cause be if it required you hurting people?
Yeah, and I, on the positive side, if somebody's coming to kill your children, it's
Oh, of course,
okay to hurt them.
of course.
I saw there's somebody, this a book written by a neurologist saying that war is natural to human beings. What utter nonsense! And that he feels sorry for pacifists. And it was like, I wonder if he's ever looked the word up, because a pacifist is somebody who wishes to negotiate rather than fight.
What a jerk.
Oh,
Oh my
stop
God,
bothering with
dude,
these
come on.
things. I did write a rude letter to New Scientist about it. But so, yeah,
Yeah.
never. I
There's
think
never again.
sometimes fear to hurt another in a
That's
just
right.
cause would be
That's
better.
right. No, it's another one of those, let's lock it down. Let's lock the loyalty down. Let's lock the commitment down. Let's really make it clear that if we have to, break a few eggs to make this omelet, let's not hesitate, you know.
Can't make an omelette without breaking legs.
There you go.
Um, don't desire to be liked or admired. And this is a man who said that the highest and best particle is the particle of admiration. So you
That's
don't want
right.
that one.
Within 2 years of giving that lecture series, he's dropping this, right? And of course, we've already been over with the need, with the praise, approval, sympathy line that Hubbard lived in this place. So,
Yeah.
so he's really just reiterating more of that.
And I think we
14.
should, I think we should desire to be liked. I don't know about desiring to be admired. I think desiring to be appreciated is good. Admired is a bit hokey. Adulated is crazy. But
Oh, absolutely. I don't think we can help it though.
yeah,
I think it's just part of us. I mean,
if
we
we're
are
normal,
social creatures.
yeah.
I mean,
So
the idea that peacocks want to be admired. I mean, it's a thing. It's just part of our biology. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be admired. We only lose the plot on it when we dial it up to 11, like we do in the damn, with narcissists and celebrities and cults and oh, look at
and
me, look
Spinal
at me.
Tap.
I mean, Kardashians might be taking it a little too far, right?
Yeah, having funded the Pentecostalist movement in the United States. That was their great grandfather,
Really?
Kardashians. Yeah, so
Wow.
the whole Branham, absolute
Wow.
con artist, madness that is partly Pentecostalism and partly the Ku Klux Klan, of course, its other offshoot, funded by Kardashian money. But there we go.
Gross. Gross,
Women with big asses. What can we say? Nothing.
Well, what can we say? That's right. Now we've got two more here. We're going to wrap this up with number 14. Be your own advisor, keep your own counsel, and select your own decisions. Again, it feels empowering to people, but it's an isolating point and one that actually is a faux inspiration because it's not. You don't have all the answers and you never will. You're going to need other people's help and advice and direction. Again, we're social creatures. This is how it's supposed to be. The outlier, the weirdness is that there are people among us who actually think and preach solitary individuality is where it's all at. After a while, you just kind of like, dude, you really don't get it, do you? And Hubbard was here's Hubbard doing it.
What's true for you is true. No, it bloody isn't.
That's right.
That's right. Be your own advisor. Never listen to L. Ron Hubbard. You see, if he just, put that in. Of course, grown-ups ask for advice.
That's right. But Hubbard didn't, did he?
No.
I mean, I actually think about it right now. Like I'm sitting here going, okay, how many times did Hubbard sit down and actually how many times do we see him seeking out and taking other people's advice?
Not
literally no. I can't remember.
Or not admitting that he's plagiarized.
That's right.
People.
That's right.
That's the problem.
That's right. Because you get to a Trump and who I believe is further down the narcissistic spectrum, if you want to, think that way, than even Hubbard. I believe Hubbard's affirmations show us a conflicted individual, whereas somebody who's pure, there's no conflict, and there's the solipsism, as you correctly label, and here's where I think we find people like Trump just live. They just live there, right? I don't need anybody else's advice. There is nothing anybody else can tell me that's going to make my decision making any better than it already is. I already know what to do, right? It's that attitude. And I think that comes through here.
And I think we should select our own decisions. And finally, be true to your own goals. Yes.
Please.
At last, something I can just absolutely agree with.
That's right. That's right. So that's your code. That's your code of honor there. And I think we've shown, at least in some of our talks here, right, that this is a way of putting Scientologists, and just another way of putting Scientologists in a place where they think they are superior to other people at the moral plane. And let's remember, with my model, morality is deep and it is important. And when people are compelled by what they think is their morality, when their moral principles are at play, you will never find somebody more certain, more right, and more ready to just raise the fist if you start pushing back, right? This is that level, which is why I think Hubbard went there, because I think these guys have if not an intellectual understanding, a sort of animal understanding or cunning, that this is where you got to get people, is at their points of right, wrong, right? And this code of honor lives there. So I think this is probably one of the more powerful early fundamental or sort of pillars of control that Hubbard put there, but it kind of hides in plain sight because it's voluntary. Well, you can choose to follow it or not,
but never.
That's right.
Cool.
I take my wrap up on that. So
we did it. We actually got to the end of something.
I know, right? Thanks, Jon. I really appreciate your help today on this one, because I didn't want to do this by myself. There's a lot here, and your input was awesome. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It's been great, good fun, and we'll do something else soon.
You bet.
Everybody like and subscribe and buy our books.
That's right. All the things.
Yeah.
All the things, thumbs up all
And,
around.
and
And you'll find a link to Jon's channel there below in the description section, like we do every time I have Jon on. So you can go check out Jon Atack Family and Friends YouTube channel. And from there, link to all of his books and amazing creative works, because he's got videos, he's got books. The guy does painting, he does photography. I mean, he's kind of this all-around guy. So check out his channel, check out his work, and
Grant, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
all right, guys. See you next week. Bye-bye.